That might have been too much information or not enough information, but thank you for choosing this as your area of interest for today. We have about 45 minutes, as I understand it, maybe 50, depending on in terms of how much we can go beyond noon. So I just want to get a little bit of a feel. I know you guys have been here for like 7 weeks already, is that right? And you're here for about 2 months? 2 more weeks. Gotcha. Okay, great. How many of you are from Boston? Most of you, okay. And where else are the rest of you from? New Jersey, I know.
Long Island.
Memphis, Long Island. San Francisco? No, no kidding. I grew up in San Francisco.
No.
Yeah. I just gave a talk at Temple Emmanuel a couple of weeks ago. Yeah. So first of all, welcome, and I would love to get to know all of you a little bit better, but we have very limited time, and I've been asked to speak about some specific issues, so I'll start with that. But my usual practice, especially in a group like this where you guys, I'm sure, have a lot of experiences that you've had in Israel already the last few weeks, and many of you have been here before, I know, and you may have some specific questions related to our topic. So let's get started, and I will try and make sure that I leave enough room for questions. So some of you know a little bit about me beyond what Rebecca just mentioned, but I just came out with a book. It's called My Israel Trail. I don't have books to sell here, so this is not a sales pitch. If you're interested, it's available on Amazon. But it's a book about two things. It's like two books in one. How many of you have read or saw the movie Wild? Not so many. Okay. And what about Eat, Pray, Love? Oh, okay, a few more. How about A Walk in the Woods with Robert Redford? Okay. So we're not reading the movies that are kind of like Trekking and personal growth stories. Fair enough. You guys are, how many of you are divorced? Just kidding. So I got a divorce, and this divorce was not my choice. It was not something that I had requested, and it was something that quite literally turned my world upside down. And we're not going to talk a lot today about divorce because I'm not sure if that's really your area of interest or focus today, but when going through any sort of personal challenge, losing a loved one, or the breakup of a relationship, also at your age, not just at my age, and it doesn't have to be an official divorce type of thing, or losing a job, whatever it might be, the personal challenges that we face are often difficult for us to cope with and to deal with. And for me, my divorce was very much that. And one of the coping mechanisms, aside from the dozen books that I read about how to move on with your life, one of the coping mechanisms that I found that I also hadn't looked for, it just kind of happened, was that I hiked the Israel Trail. How many of you have ever heard of the Israel National Trail? Okay, Yofi, most of you. So the Israel Trail is like the Appalachian Trail, if you will, or the Pacific Crest Trail, or other types of treks that exist in the world. But obviously the Israel Trail is a bit different because it's in Israel. It's 600 miles long from Eilat in the south to the border with Lebanon in the north at Kibbutz Dan. And I hiked it in 8 weeks, nonstop, all alone, with a 50-pound pack on my back. Now, I was 51. This is something that is really usually the purview of the 21-year-old crowd. It's your guys' peers in Israel who, after the army, decide that, you know what, I want to break. I've had 2 or 3 years in the army. I'm going to hike the Israel Trail. It's a pretty well-known thing. Some do all of it. Some do some of it. But my experience was a little bit different because I was older. I also had no experience. I grew up in California and San Francisco, and I hiked a lot in the Sierras and what have you. And here in Israel, living here for 35 years, I went on hikes every year with my kids and what have you. But these are day hikes you're talking about. I'd never done a trek like this. Did I mention I had a 50-pound pack on my back? It was a grueling challenge for me physically and, of course, emotionally because I was getting over my divorce. But what was fascinating to me is in the course of the 8 weeks of hiking, the length and breadth of the land of Israel, the lessons that I learned, lessons from the actual hike itself, physical hike lessons, like occasionally stop and turn around and look back to see how far you've come. I don't know how many of you are experienced hikers, but most of us, when we hike, we have a destination. You could be hiking for 2 hours or 2 days. We don't often stop and turn around And it's amazing the perspective that it gives you. You've just walked through whatever it might be, 2 hours or 2 days worth of hiking and vistas and forests or deserts or what have you. And you'd think, therefore, it's not a big deal to turn around and look back. But the perspective is entirely different. It's like looking at a whole different vista because you're looking at it from a different perspective. I know that sounds a little bit mundane as a lesson, but you can imagine how it applies to most of us in our lives. Sometimes it's a good idea to stop, to look back, to see how far we've come. I couldn't believe on the second day of my trek, looking from the hills overlooking Eilat, Har Shlomo, Har Yoram, Male Amram, these 500-meter ascents, which I had done with this 50-pound pack on my back, and turning around and seeing, wow, look at how far I've come, was for me a real eye-opener. And obviously, it kind of started to apply itself to the challenge that I was facing of trying to move on with my life, as it were, and get over this devastating divorce that I had experienced. So the lessons that I learned on the trail, which I'll describe very briefly in a moment, were things which actually then helped me to meet this personal challenge that I was dealing with. And in the end, after I finished the trail, I ended up writing a book, partially to give people who either are interested in Israel but have never visited, or have visited but have never hiked the trail, to give people the opportunity to kind of vicariously walk the land of Israel with me, and to experience some of the challenges, some of the vistas, some of these amazing places in the desert and the forests in the north and others that I was able to experience while walking through the land of Israel, and also the people I met and the feelings that I had and the contemplation and the reflections I had about our history, about the land of Israel, its geography, the history of our people, and the connection that I felt to the people of Israel. And that was one of the reasons that I wrote the book. And the other was because these lessons that I learned that helped me get over my personal challenge, I thought perhaps might be helpful to others facing their own challenges. So the book was launched about 2 months ago, and thank God it's gotten decent reviews. But we're not here so much to talk about the book as much as we are to put in context the issues that you guys are dealing with on your college campuses, or thinking about in terms of the public discourse about Israel and some of the controversial issues that come up in the media, or with our political leaders, or in church groups, or in our friendship circles, or what have you. And the book, and my experience of hiking the Israel Trail, can help put a little bit into context some of the major issues that we're dealing with constantly in our interactions with others about Israel. And obviously you guys, having spent 8 weeks, 10 weeks, whatever it might be, here in Israel after having visited perhaps before, you guys are the experts now. Now maybe you're not expert. Maybe you don't feel like an expert. But at base, because you've been here, not just on a 10-day birthright trip or a trip around, a week with your family or something at age 12, but you have lived here for a couple of months, and therefore you will be seen as an authoritative source of information. And one of the things you're doing today in this very intensive kind of advocacy or education or kind of getting an overview of the situation day that you have today with all these different speakers is to help give you ammunition. Ammunition maybe is a bad word. We'll call it tools. Yes, it is a battle. We're in a battle for the image of Israel and the perception of Israel and Israel's legitimacy, which we'll talk about a lot. But if you want, instead of looking at it as a conflictual situation, because there's a lot of arguments going on, obviously in college campus or in your own family or what have you, it's also a question of just having the information so that when you're having a conversation with your roommate, or when a professor says something that seems to you a bit off, that you actually know, that you understand relatively quickly whether or not the person's saying something accurately and whether or not it's worth engaging in a discussion. So what I want to do today is to discuss 3 fundamental myths which I believe not only permeate the public discourse about Israel and about our conflict here and about our history, but also are so patently obvious in terms of how wrong they are, that they are myths, that it should give you walking out of here a really strong sense of confidence in speaking about these issues should you have the opportunity to do so, or writing a letter to the editor or whatever it might be. And part of that will be a very quick reference to something called the 3 Ds. which we'll get to. Some of you smiled. You're familiar with the 3Ds? Okay. Any of you, others, familiar with the 3Ds of the new anti-Semitism? Okay. So we're going to spend a few minutes talking about that as well, and then we'll come back and bring kind of it full circle and how it relates to my hike on the Israel Trail. So what are the three myths that I'm referring to? At base, think of it this way. When you read about, first of all, when you read about the Arab-Israel conflict, most frequently we hear a particular reference point. What is this conflict all about? What is the Arab conflict all about? You tell me before I write down the word that I'm thinking of. Anybody? Okay, silence is good, but I'm not going to let you get away with just not answering. Somebody has to have an answer. What's the Arab-Israel conflict all about? Yeah.
The word that comes to mind is land.
Land. Wow, what a great word. Go on. Anybody else? Yeah.
Home.
Home. That's good too. Others? I love the word home. That's great.
Ideology.
Okay. Wow. So I don't have to give this talk, I don't think. Ideology. Okay, you're not meant to be able to read that. Already. That's for me. Fascinating, and you'll see in a minute why this is amazing what you just said, because land, homeland, our home, and ideology are almost ways of looking at the three myths that I'm going to talk about. I'm going to take this word land, and the word I'm going to use is territorial. Yes, you are supposed to read that. Everybody talks about this conflict as if it's a territorial conflict. As if we could just draw the borders somewhere, Palestinians will have a state. Those who self-identify, the Arab community that calls itself Palestinian, they'll have a state, wherever it might be, don't worry about that. And Israel, as the nation state of the Jewish people, will have a state, and peace will break out. There is so much talk about this as a territorial conflict, and that is the first myth I want you to think about. If this is a territorial conflict, then to a great extent, we have some amazing historical proofs how much that is a myth. Because if it was a territorial conflict, it would have been resolved years ago. In the early 1920s, when the first discussions of a partition were taking place, when the international community recognized the legitimacy of the idea of the return of the Jewish people to our ancestral homeland. So there were discussions of, well, you know what? There are Arab residents there. We should also carve out part of this for an Arab state. In fact, that's what happened when Great Britain, against the terms of the mandate that they were given to foment, to encourage, and to facilitate the creation of a Jewish homeland in what was then called Mandatory Palestine, when they broke off 70% of the territory of the area that they were given for the creation of a national home for the Jewish people, and created unilaterally and against the terms of their mandate the Emirate of Transjordan. We won't get into the history of why they did that, as to kind of pay back Abdullah, because they had promised him the Hijaz, which is where Mecca and Medina are, and then they reneged on that promise, and therefore they had to give him a consolation prize. And so they said, here, take this 70% eastern side of the Palestine mandate, which we, Britain, control, even though we're not supposed to do this, and we'll give you that emirate, which then got its independence in 1946. But my point is, if this was a territorial conflict, we have had numerous opportunities to resolve that conflict based on territorial divisions. That was the first. Then the second, of course, was the Peel Commission in 1936, the Partition Plan in 1947, the negotiations to end the War of Independence, the Arab attack by 5 Arab armies on the nascent burgeoning state of Israel in 1947 to 1949, when there were negotiations for our armistice agreement, and there was some discussion that perhaps we can come to some agreement here in terms of peace. And then again in 1967, after Israel took over the territories, made it very, very clear that although we have a claim to these disputed territories, a legal claim, a historical claim, a claim based on the United Nations Charter and the admissibility of retaining territory from which you are attacked, that you gain in a defensive military operation, we said, the government of Israel said publicly, we are not insisting on retaining these territories. We're not insisting on pressing our legitimate legal claim to these territories. let's make peace. And we had the three famous no's of Khartoum that many of you are familiar with. No peace, no negotiations, no recognition of Israel by the Arab League. And you can skip ahead, the Oslo process, before that the Madrid process, more recent plans and peace plans and ideas that have been proposed that would resolve a conflict were it territorial. But I want to give you, aside from the historical issue of it being not a territorial conflict, there is a conceptual framework also that I want to get to with this second myth. We have a second myth. The second myth is that the Palestinian and other Arab leaders, who can read that, are moderate. I'm not wasting time to write it clearly. Now, I want you to understand something, because the description that Rebecca gave about me does not nearly go into enough detail to give you a little bit of an understanding of where I'm coming from when talking to you about these issues. I've lived here for 35 years. For over 2 decades, I worked with Natan Sharansky, somebody whose name may be familiar to you, who is a champion of democracy and freedom, liberal values, and human rights. I have spent most of the time that I've lived here in Israel in ongoing dialogue supporting the idea of Palestinian democracy, democracy in the wider Arab world, and supporting the idea of some sort of Palestinian state in some borders, whatever could be negotiated. Why am I telling you this? Because I'm about to talk about how the leaders of the Palestinian society and the leaders of the wider Arab world are not moderate. And this isn't to say that the Arab Palestinians who self-identify as such don't have a right to an independent entity or state. That's a policy discussion that reasonable people can debate. And I'm not saying that all of Palestinian or Arab society is not moderate. What I want you to understand is that when the newspapers described Mahmoud Abbas as the moderate president of the Palestinian Authority, I want you to understand how insidious that is in misrepresenting the supposed partners that we have to discuss peace with. Now, I've worked with the media for years, and I understand the media in particular, and politicians also, need to use a kind of shorthand. If Iran and Hamas and Hezbollah and ISIS and Al-Qaeda are the extremists, then there has to be some way to describe Mahmoud Abbas and Fatah, or Egypt, or the leaders of Jordan, as not quite as extreme as those extremists that we're all in this civilizational struggle in the West against these jihadist terrorists. Now, I understand the need, but let's face it, we're speaking English. Moderate means something. To be a moderate means to be conciliatory. It means to be tolerant. It means to be open to negotiation. It means to be willing to countenance the existence, let alone the legitimate grievances of the other. There are moderate individuals and organizations in Palestinian and the wider Arab and Muslim society. I happen to know most of those Arab and Muslim and self-described Palestinian leaders who are actually moderate, and these are the people that I do believe we'll eventually make peace with. But when the New York Times or CNN or others describe Mahmoud Abbas as moderate, I want you to think about that. I want you to think about this quote, and I quote, "Go forth and defend Jerusalem with all your might, for every drop of blood spilled there is sacred. At whatever price, do not let the Zionist usurper place his filthy feet anywhere near Al-Aqsa." This is a direct quote from Mahmoud Abbas about 2 or 3 years ago. And I could parse for you, but we don't have enough time, the incredibly deep and resonant Islamic anti-Semitic themes in that one little half a sentence. In terms of the filthy feet, which is a specific issue in reference to an Islamic trope of the inadmissibility of others to come into Islamic holy sites. Talking about every drop of blood spilled there is sacred is a call for martyrdom, for Palestinians or other Arabs to kill themselves while killing others. Defending Jerusalem is a ridiculous assertion that was made a few years ago that Israel was somehow threatening Al-Aqsa. Calling us the Zionist usurper, what is that supposed to suggest? Well, that's where we get to our third myth, which we'll get to in a second. The idea that the Zionists are usurpers, meaning they have no legitimacy, they have no rights here, They have no claim here. Those are not the words of a moderate. And a moderate is not somebody who rejects every overture of peace which the Palestinian leadership and the wider Arab world, with the exception, the amazing exception of Anwar Sadat and King Hussein of Jordan, but which the wider Arab world and Muslim world and Palestinian leadership has rejected time and time again over the last 100 years, the willingness of Israeli or Jewish leadership to be conciliatory, to make concessions, and to make peace with our leaders, with our neighbors. So the first myth is that this is a territorial conflict, and the second myth is that our Arab interlocutors are somehow moderate, which is not to say we shouldn't negotiate with them. I'm just talking about understanding. If we want to reach peace, we have to know what the reality on the ground is that we're dealing with. The third combines these two and relates to this word that somebody called ideology. There are those, I'm sorry, I'm actually going to correct myself a little bit because there's a few different connections here. The third myth, the ideology is actually overriding all of these three. I want to go into a specific issue in the third myth, which is the word settlements. There are those who say that those nefarious Jewish communities in the disputed territories of Judea and Samaria, otherwise described as the West Bank of the Jordan River, that those terrible Jewish communities are the primary obstacle to peace in the Middle East. Many say that. Your professors, perhaps friends and family, certainly political leaders, obviously campus activists who are anti-Israel. But let's go a little bit deeper into that myth. We're aware of the fact that there was hostility before the very, very first settlement was established in the early 1970s, aren't we? Was there peace before the first Jews moved into Judea and Samaria? No, there wasn't. And there's another historical proof to that, because when we dismantled settlements and we expelled 11,000 law-abiding Israeli citizens, and I say law-abiding because they were sent to Gush Katif and to other areas in Gaza, in the Gaza Strip, by Labor and Likud leaders, Labor and Likud governments in Israel. It's not some right-wing conspiracy, the settlement of Jews in the territories. And we uprooted and expelled 11,000 law-abiding citizens and dismantled all the settlements, those Jewish communities in Gush Katif and Gaza, as you know. And what did we get in return? I know you know the answer. Rockets and suicide bombers and attacks and tunnels and kidnappings, and now kites with fire on them and what have you. We didn't get peace. If the settlements were the primary obstacle to peace, then dismantling the settlements would have enabled the Palestinians and their society and their leadership to create a Singapore on the Eastern Mediterranean. We could have had peace then, and we have seen time and again that it's not the settlements which are the primary obstacle to peace. For the record, I'm not suggesting that reasonable people can't argue as to whether or not Jews should or shouldn't be building or living in the disputed territories of Judea and Samaria. And for the record, you may have noticed I use the terms Judea and Samaria. Not because I wear one of these, not because I'm some right-wing fanatic. Those happen to be the historically accurate and cartographically accurate terms for the hilly region to the east of the coastal plain of this area. And I've had different debates with Palestinian leaders. I once had a Palestinian cabinet minister get up and walk out of a room. The room was in Eastern Jerusalem, by the way, at the American Colony Hotel, where we were having one of these back-channel discussions between Israelis and Arab Palestinians. And he got up in a huff. He said, "I can't sit at a table where somebody's using the words Judea and Samaria." And we broke for a break. And when we came back, I asked from the person leading this kind of 20-person back-channel discussion for the right to speak just for a minute or two to kind of calm things down. And he gave me that. And I brought in a map that was on the wall of the American Colony Hotel, which was then owned by an Arab family. It's in the Arab side of Eastern Jerusalem. It is, without question, not some Israeli or Zionist establishment. And I took a map off the wall and showed this cabinet minister that the map said Menashe and Dan and Binyamin and Judea and Samaria, because that is, until about 30 years ago, the terms, those were the terms used to describe this area. And I'm only taking that tangent with you for a second to explain why and how it's okay to use a generic term like disputed territories instead of occupied territories. It's okay to use the term Judea and Samaria in addition to referring to these areas as the West Bank of the Jordan River or disputed territories. It was a bit of a tangent, but important for your understanding of the issues that we're dealing with when we're trying to fight these different myths. And that'll lead us also to this ideological issue we'll get to in a second. I want you to understand something about the settlements too, though, from a conceptual framework, not just the historical framework, where I think it's a compelling argument that if the settlements were the primary obstacle to peace, as so many say that they are, then before there were settlements, we should have had peace. And once we dismantled settlements, we should have had peace. And that pretty well puts paid to the issue of whether the settlements really are the primary obstacle to peace, as much as people can debate whether they should or shouldn't continue to be built in. But here's a conceptual framework that I want you to consider. I asked you where you're from. Nobody said you're from Canada. I was married to a Brit for 28 years, so I know something about British society. There are hundreds of thousands of Brits who live in the south of France, who live in the south of Spain. Are they not loyal Brits? No, they're very, very proud Brits. They root for all the British soccer teams, but they prefer the sun because it rains all the time in England. So they live in the south of Spain, or they live in the south of France. In other words, they live in a country all their lives where they're a citizen of another country. There are Canadians who live in America for business reasons or personal reasons, family reasons. Americans who live in Canada. They want to escape the draft, maybe. They don't like Trump, or they didn't like Obama, or family, business, or other reasons. Think for a second conceptually. If there was real peace between Israel and the Arabs, if there was real peace, or should I say when there is real peace, between Israel and those who self-identify as Palestinians, so what problem is there with some Jews living in a state as yet to be established? It's called Palestine. How many of you know how many, either the number or the percentage, how many Arab, predominantly Muslim citizens are there in Israel? Anybody know? 20 what? 20%?
Yeah.
Approximately. 1.5 million Arab Muslims are citizens of Israel. I know that you've heard the litany of descriptions. They serve in the Knesset, they're doctors, they're lawyers, they have businesses, they're judges at our Supreme Court. Arab Israelis are part of our society. Is there no discrimination? No, there is some discrimination. Israel, like other democracies, still is working out how to deal with our minorities, just like France is with the Algerians in France, just like Britain is with Pakistani and other immigrants in Pakistan, just like America is with the African American community, or even the Latino community. We, as societies, are still working through issues of how we create a majority culture while encouraging not just the specific legal freedoms of minorities to be part of our country, but the societal and cultural acceptance and norms that comes with those kind of freedoms. We're all dealing with these issues, and Israel is too. So I'm not suggesting that there is no discrimination against the Arab citizens of Israel. What I will insist is that, number one, there is no more discrimination of Arabs in Israel than there is of African Americans or Latinos in America or Pakistanis in Britain. I will argue that there is less discrimination because you can count the African Americans in Congress and compare that to the percentage of the Arab Israelis in our Knesset, and Israel compares favorably. You can look at all sorts of liberal aspects of our society here in Israel, whether it's gays or minorities or women's rights or what have you, and argue compellingly that Israel is one of the most progressive and liberal societies in the world, even though while you are here, we're having an incredible internal debate about how we define our society, Jewish and democratic, about what we do about some progressive issues like surrogacy. Okay, we're a society that's dealing with these issues no less than America, France, or other democracies in the world. The point I'm making, though, coming back to my main point about the issue of this primary obstacle being the settlements, is the fact that there are Arabs living in Israel who are not at all in fear for their lives when they go to a movie or a mall, who serve as doctors, let alone being treated as patients in the same room as Jews or Druze or Circassians or Christian Arabs or others here in our very multicultural society. points to, I believe, a compelling conceptual argument that when we get to real peace with the Palestinians, then Jews living in a Palestinian society should be no different than Arab and Muslims living in an Israeli society. So we can't say that the settlements are the primary obstacle to peace, because technically, if we have peace, then Jewish communities in Hebron or Beit El or Shiloh or wherever else they might be shouldn't be a conceptual problem any more than a Brit living in the south of Spain or an American living in Canada. Those are the three primary myths that I want you to think about when you walk out of here today. It's a myth that it's a territorial conflict. It's a myth that the Palestinian or the other wider Arab leadership are moderates. And it's a myth that the settlements are the primary obstacle to peace. What is the primary obstacle to peace? It relates to the two things that you guys just threw out: ideology and home. We are not in a territorial conflict. We are in an ideological conflict. It is a civilizational conflict. And I can quote more not moderate pronouncements and policies and actions, not just by Mahmoud Abbas, but by the leadership of the wider Arab and Muslim world, to prove the point that this is an ideological conflict. Which brings me back to his mentioning the filthy feet of the Zionist usurpers. Let's face it. If we're Zionist usurpers, if we, the Jews, as a people, have no historical connection to this land, if we are not a people returning to our ancestral homeland, if we are not the original indigenous people of this particular slice of land on the Eastern Mediterranean, then you know what? They're right. Then we're usurpers. Then we're a colonialist enterprise, as often is described, that we came from Europe, that the world community supported our right to create our modern nation state, not because of a historical connection to this land, not because we define ourselves as a people, much more than a religion, but primarily because of guilt, Western guilt over the Holocaust. Now, you know, because you've studied enough of this, I'm presuming, that the Zionist movement started before World War II, that the international recognition of the legitimacy of that modern national liberation movement started in the late 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century. You know that. So the argument that we're some colonialist enterprise bringing Europeans over after World War II out of European guilt for the Holocaust is an absurd contention, and yet it is often used by those who would deny the legitimacy of Israel to try and argue that we are some sort of Zionist usurper. And now you get the connection, I think. Because quoting Mahmoud Abbas there, calling us a Zionist usurper, is an encapsulation of how this is not a territorial conflict, how he is not a moderate, how it has nothing to do with the settlements. It has to do with an ideological, civilizational struggle. And what's that struggle about? That's the word that you threw out, home. You don't have to be a student of anthropology or sociology, but you should understand something as a Jew, or even if some of you are not Jewish, understanding what it means to be a Jew. We're a people. I read an article before Pesach last year, which I'm happy to share with you if you'd like, about how we emerged as a people in the exodus from Egypt, well before we became a religious community. People, especially Christians, Muslims, and others, think that Judaism, it's always called one of the three great monolithic religions, the older sibling of Christianity and Islam, etc. Judaism is a faith community, but it is not only a faith community. Here's a little test for your understanding of what I'm talking about. Imagine Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, the day that many Jews who observe Jewish religious behaviors and traditions don't eat. A man walks in at the back of the synagogue. You happen to know this man. You know that his mother is Jewish and his grandmother is Jewish. He walks in and he's eating a cheeseburger in shul on Yom Kippur, breaking a dozen different rules, because he probably drove there also. How many of you would say, he's not Jewish? Nobody raised your hands. Why? Because we know that being a member of the Jewish people has nothing to do with our behaviors as observing the Jewish religion. We know this, but we don't argue it enough. We don't share that knowledge with others enough. We were a people which was forged in the challenges of our slavery in Egypt, and we came out of Egypt as a people. We were a family that became a tribe, that became a clan, that down in Egypt formed this identity as a people before we ended up at Mount Sinai to get the religious strictures of the Torah to help us understand how we were to behave as that people. This is one of the things that we have to understand if we're talking about how to stand up to this ideological battle against our very legitimacy. I want to say a quick word about the 3 Ds, then I want to wind things up and give us some time for questions. One of the biggest issues that we deal with when talking about and addressing the claims of others and the arguments that others make about Israel on any given day, about any given issue, our defensive military operations in Gaza, issues of women having the freedom to pray as they'd like at the Kotel, at the Western Wall, questions, as I said, of surrogacy or of how we define in legislation the democratic nature of our society versus the Jewish identity of our society. We often come up against those who will say that we are not legitimate. When you read that, delegitimization is one of the most powerful tools by those who hate Israel, used to question the validity of the founding of the modern nation state of the Jewish people. How many of you know how many new nation states were created in the post-war, post-colonial period? I'm going to give you a hint. There were approximately 45 or maybe 48, I don't remember the number. It was 36 at the beginning of the UN, but when Israel was founded around that time of 1945, 6, 7, when the UN was founded in 1945, there were about 40 or so states members of the UN. Today there's 196. So in answer to my question, there were about 70 nations created in what's called the post-colonial period right after World War II, meaning around the time that Israel's legitimacy was acknowledged by the United Nations. How many of you have heard on campus a debate? How many of you have been invited to a debate, let alone seen somebody on the plaza tabling in order to protest the establishment of Pakistan, or Bangladesh, or Montenegro, or Croatia, or Slovenia, or Slovakia, or the Czech Republic? How many of you have heard debates about whether or not Catalonia, or Basque, or maybe if we talk about Canada, the question of Quebec wanting its independence, Tibet for that matter? Actually, about Tibet, there are occasionally student protests, I'm glad to see. There is one other issue that students are interested in. But when it comes to the issue of nation states that are not legitimate because they are newly founded and recognized by the UN, you know that Pakistan and Bangladesh were carved out of the north of India in the same period that the partition plan was suggested. That was all in vogue in those days, in the mid-40s. How do we resolve conflict between two warring civilizations or religions or ethnic communities? We separate. We took India, we said, okay, Muslims to Pakistan and Bangladesh, and Hindus in India. Great, we solved the problem. Millions of people were killed, by the way, in the forced marches of creating those countries and forcing Muslims in particular to move to Bangladesh or to Pakistan. But we're not going to go down that road right now. I'm only pointing out that there's no discussion of the legitimacy of Pakistan. There's no discussion of the legitimacy of Jordan, which was created completely arbitrarily by Great Britain, as I described before. It's only Israel's legitimacy which is questioned, which is rather ironic because, as I said, you don't have to be a scholar of anthropology or sociology, but you know what's interesting? People who do know, people who fight for the indigenous rights, for instance, of Aborigines in Australia or First Nation in Canada or Native Americans in America, they look at the Jews as the prime example of an indigenous people who return to sovereignty in their ancestral homeland in, let's admit it, a rather miraculous fashion after 2,000 years of not having sovereignty in our ancestral homeland. But those who are the experts in the academic disciplines that relate to how we define indigenous people recognize that the Jewish people, that the Jews as a people are the indigenous people in this region. Nothing I'm saying says we shouldn't allow or encourage or try to help to put together a peace agreement that leads to the establishment of a Palestinian state. I've repeated that a few times so that you don't get me wrong and think that I'm saying, therefore, Israel should take over all the territories or take over Jordan or take over the entire Middle East. My point is not to argue, because I said reasonable people can discuss what the policy prescription should be to bring peace between Arabs and Israelis. What I'm talking about is the fact that delegitimization is the first D of the 3 Ds of the new anti-Semitism. And for the record, I'll send you an article about this if you want, because our time is running short. But there is a historical basis for an understanding of these 3 Ds, because these represent the kind of attitudes of traditional classic anti-Semitism based on religious motifs. In other words, Judaism has no legitimacy because it was replaced by Christianity. That is one of the sources of traditional anti-Semitism. But now, instead of Judaism having no legitimacy, what is described is that Israel has no legitimacy, and that's the first D. 5 minutes. Got it here. Thanks. The second D, and this is a bit of a tangent, but it's an important thing to walk out of here with. The second D is demonization. Again, traditional anti-Semitism, you've all seen the caricatures in Der Stürmer or other Nazi material, or perhaps you've seen in medieval materials of the Jew as a rat or a spider or an octopus with their tentacles around the world. Demonization and dehumanization, the Jew as a Satan, as the devil with a tail, that's traditional anti-Semitism. But today, when you look at caricatures, including in the West, let alone in the Muslim world, Israel is the hook-nosed Jew with long peyot, but an Israeli flag on their hat. They're the ones who are demonized. They're the ones who are portrayed as an animal, as an octopus, as a rat. They're the ones who are portrayed as Satan. And that demonization is the second D of the 3 Ds of the new anti-Semitism. The third is discrimination, or double standards. And again, I'm just doing this very quickly so that you get the idea, and I'll happily share, I'll send to Eric or Michael the article that you can read a little bit more in detail about this. Traditional anti-Semitism literally had different rules for Jews. In medieval Germany, Jews couldn't walk on one side of the sidewalk. Throughout Europe, Jews could not build a synagogue as high as the church steeple of any local town. In the former Soviet Union, there were quotas for Jews to get into college, and they were restricted in where they could live and where they could move in their movements of their families. Even, by the way, in America, some of you said you're from New York.
Yeah. I am.
There were laws on the books. Jim Crow South is one thing, but there were laws on the books in New York. Condominiums were sold, and in the sale agreement, it was stipulated that you couldn't sell your apartment to Jews. That's discrimination. And that's a double standard that Israel today, as the Jew among the nations, is held to a different standard than the rest of the world. When America makes a mistake and kills an entire wedding party in Afghanistan as part of their military operations against Al-Qaeda, they say, whoa, we're really sorry, that was a miscalculation. We really regret the loss of innocent life, and move on. There's no Security Council condemnation or even discussion. But when Israel attacks a Hamas military headquarters and some civilians are killed, there's condemnation from governments around the world, op-eds in newspapers, Security Council resolutions, etc. That is a double standard. And I could go into a lot more detail with more examples, but I won't. These are the 3 Ds of the new anti-Semitism. And these 3 Ds are part and parcel of this ideological battle, struggle, that we are up against. That we have to understand, all of us. I don't care how active you are, whether it's just in conversation with your family, who says, well, you came back from Israel, tell me, what's wrong with those Israelis? Why can't they just make peace with their neighbors? And what about those settlements? That's the primary obstacle to peace in the world, or in the region. Now you have a little bit more of a tool or a toolbox, a set of tools to answer these things. And I want to close by saying two things. First of all, let's just review very quickly. The three myths were that it's not a territorial conflict, that our interlocutors, who we still should talk with, but that they are not moderate, they may be less extreme than the real extremist jihadists, but they ain't moderate, and that it's not the settlements that's the primary obstacle to peace. The primary obstacle to peace today is as it was 100 years ago, and for the entire last century, the ideological hostility towards the idea of a Jewish connection with our land, a return of the Jews to our ancestral homeland, and therefore the legitimacy of the modern nation-state of Israel, the nation-state of the Jewish people. Which is why the 3Ds is so important, because that delegitimization, which is expressed in the demonization and holding Israel to a different standard than the rest of the world, is part and parcel of, unfortunately, most of public discourse about our issues here. When I hiked the Israel Trail, one of the things that I describe in my book is the incredible connection I felt with my people, with our people and our history. And I want to leave you with one anecdote just to illustrate that you understand how it relates to the legitimacy of our founding and to the fact, and it's a fact, this is not, you'll notice, I've said a few times, reasonable people can argue about different policy issues. There's nothing I've said today that takes any policy stance on any of the issues that one can argue about. Settlements or peace or our defensive military operations or our internal domestic issues. Nothing that I've said today relates to that, because nothing I've said today is trying to make an argument or trying to persuade somebody or being an advocate. These are facts. This is the reality. This is a civilizational conflict. That's reality. That's not an interpretation. One of the things that I experienced on the trail, my walking the trail, helped to concretize this in my mind. I was hiking up in the northern Galilee, near the border with Lebanon, and I'm hiking along a forest called the Baram Forest, between Nahal Dishon and the kibbutz itself called Baram, near Sasa, if any of you are familiar with that, right on the border with Lebanon. And I'm walking along in a lovely forested area on a dirt path, and all of a sudden in front of me I come up to this tomb, a blue painted tomb, kind of oblong and with a domed top. I was ready for a break anyway, so I took my pack off, that 50-pound pack I've mentioned once or twice, and I got some water out, and I saw a plaque by the tomb, and the plaque said, Kever shel Yeshayahu ben Amoz. Now, I'm a religiously observant guy, and I'm relatively well-learned, but I have no idea who that is. Some guy named Yeshayahu ben Amoz. I happen to have reception for my cell phone, which I didn't turn on very often. I decided I wanted to turn it on to see whose grave is here in the middle of a forest, in the middle of nowhere. Yeshayahu ben Amoz is the prophet Isaiah. Swords and plowshares, the lion and the lamb, that guy. I'm stumbling across the tomb of one of the prophets of Israel in the middle of a forest in the north of the country. This is a tomb that has no paved road to it that people can come to in a pilgrimage and pray at, like the tomb of Shimon Bar Yochai and Meron. It's just there. Why am I referring to that in reference to everything else we've discussed today? Because it's just an example, one example, of how what we are dealing with, what we are relating to here is not just some country that has a right to defend itself like every other country. And we're not even talking about a country like America or Canada or France or Britain where we as citizens of that country can be proud of it because we like its values or because it has a history which we've related to since we were brought up. What we're talking about is our country. And walking in this country for me was walking in the footsteps of our prophets, in the footsteps of our ancestors. And by the way, you've got another 2 weeks here or so, each of you. I would hope maybe you'll have some free time, or maybe you can get, I know these programs are organized like every day there's something else and it's all very set in stone. But if you haven't yet gotten out for a hike, wherever you are, there's part of the Israel Trail right here across right over there. The Israel Trail goes from Hadassah Ein Kerem, the Hadassah Hospital, down through Kibbutz Tzorah, by Kibbutz Shoresh, and down to Misilat Zion, Shar Hagai area, right here. And it's amazing, and you should take the opportunity to walk a few steps in the footsteps of our prophets. Abba even said, Zionism is nothing more, but also nothing less, than the Jewish people's sense of origin and destination in the land linked eternally with its name. My hike on the Israel Trail connected me with our people, with our history, with our shared destiny, in a way that has affected me deeply, and affects the way that I relate to our connection between Am Yisrael, the people of Israel, Eretz Yisrael, the land of Israel, Masoret Yisrael, Torah Yisrael, the spiritual religious heritage of Israel, and of course, Medinat Yisrael, the modern nation state of Israel. I hope that you'll come away from this understanding those three myths, understanding how you might use the 3Ds in your own activities, but most importantly, feeling a little taste of that connection that you have since you're here, and that you can have even more strongly if you remember walking along this land is not like walking the Appalachian Trail, as enjoyable and beautiful as that might be. But this is the Israel Trail, and that's one of the reasons why I called my book My Israel Trail. Not only because the book is about my own struggle to get over my divorce and the path that I took, and not in a sense of possession, it's mine and not somebody else's, but it's that the Israel Trail is mine because it's my people's, and it's yours because you're part of that people too. Let's leave it there. I promised you time for questions, so I'm happy to take a few questions. Can somebody turn the air conditioner a little bit colder, because I understand you turned it a bit warmer, which made sense at that time, but now I think it's a bit warm in here. Questions? Comments? Arguments? Yeah.
Did you do the hike by yourself?
I did, all alone.
2 months.
All alone. 8 weeks, 42 days of hiking. I have to clarify that, though, since you asked. I did it all alone in the sense that I organized and planned and walked every day alone. Of course, some days I would meet people coming towards me or passing me. I mentioned younger crowds do the hike, and I was 51, so more passing me than me passing them. So I did have interactions with others. There were 2 days where I actually hiked with somebody, one of whom I met the night before, one of whom I met the morning of. But aside from those 2 days, I walked it on my own. And interestingly enough, when I was writing the book, reviewing my journal entries, I found that there were 12 days that I didn't see a single soul from morning to night. And I describe a little bit some of the contemplative, almost meditative aspects of the walk itself, especially to the deserts in the south, being all alone with my thoughts, going nuts, literally. Question? There was a hand over here. That's okay if there's none, but let's give it another second. Anybody? Yeah.
I'm actually really interested in the solitude. Was it 12 consecutive days? And also, regardless of that, what were feelings that you experienced during that?
This will be the last answer, okay. Well, thank you for asking, because that leads us a little bit more into the personal nature, and obviously I'm happy to speak with you more afterwards if you like. Read the book. There's an ebook too, by the way, so, affordable. I'm not promoting the book here, as I said. A lot of the stories about the hike itself relate to that solitude. They weren't 12 consecutive days. The 12 days I was referring to were spaced throughout the hike, where it's just coincidental that I noticed, looking back at my journal, that on that particular day, I hadn't seen a single soul, as I said. You can imagine that the first few weeks of the hike were very much focused on my just getting my head around the fact that I was in a situation I never would have expected to be. And therefore it took me a while. And one of the things that I learned in those first few weeks of what I would call, I have a friend who I sent a picture to, I think it's in the book, of me sitting on kind of a mountaintop meditating. I took a selfie, like timed selfie from the back, and I sent it to this friend of mine, who happens to be a psychologist, but it doesn't matter, he's one of my closest friends. I said to him, hey, look, I'm meditating on a mountaintop. He writes back, he says, Ari, this whole walk is just one long meditation. Which was very true. I don't know if any of you have done what's called walking meditation, but even with a 50-pound pack on your back, walking and the repetition and the silence of the desert was something that was incredibly powerful. And I came to a number of conclusions, as I mentioned at the beginning, one of which was a general acceptance of the situation I found myself in. Another one was a great sense of forgiveness of myself for my own mistakes, of my wife for her decision to leave, of God for putting me in this situation or what have you. And I reached a number of other different conclusions in terms of what was giving my life meaning, but all from this sense of humility that started with my hike the first maybe week in the desert, of being alone, surrounded by literally nothing. And I don't know if you guys are deeply immersed in some of the sources that we have in our tradition, but many of our prophets, King David as well, spent a lot of time in the desert. And the whole issue of the silence of the desert, the lack of distraction. At one point in the Judean desert, which, by the way, well, now I've given away the answer, but just to round out this thought, the largest nature reserve in Israel is not one that you've ever heard of. It's called the Judean Desert Nature Reserve. And guess what's there? Nothing. Which is why I've never heard of it. When I say nothing, I mean no shrubs, no plants, no birds, no ants, no beetles. It was that day that gave me a particular, profound sense of humility, being part of a wider universe. I don't want to wax all kind of poetic or sound weird about talking about I had some revelation and I felt at one with the universe. Although if you read the book, you'll see that is kind of where I go with that, because it was powerful. And so I just want to close, because we have to close, by both thanking you for your attention. I promise I'll send you those articles I mentioned if you want a bit more detail on the 3Ds and some of the other issues. And I hope you'll take the time, if not this trip, then your next trip to Israel, to hike even for a half a day on the Israel Trail, because I think you